Hello and welcome to Charged Stories. Today I'm going to tell you the story of the father with no seat and the mansion that vanished at dawn. The history of what would eventually become known as the Willow Estate tragedy does not begin with the grand arrival of moving trucks or the cold silence of a legal eviction, but rather with the rhythmic, bone-deep ache of manual labor that defined the first 4 decades of Gerald Sterling's existence. To understand the man who would eventually vanish a mansion at dawn, one must first visualize the soot-stained hands and the sweat-soaked flannel shirts of a young Gerald in the early 1980s, standing amidst the skeletal steel frames of rising skyscrapers in the city center. In those days, Gerald was not a name known to the elite. He was simply another anonymous figure in a hard hat, a man who understood the fundamental physics of weight and balance, and who believed that every brick laid was a brick that must remain for a century. His philosophy was rooted in the concept of building to last, a radical notion in a world that was already beginning to lean toward the disposable and the superficial. For 40 years, Gerald Sterling functioned as a silent architect of other men's dreams, hauling literal tons of concrete and timber, his body becoming a living map of scars, calluses, and the persistent, dull roar of joint pain that comes from a life spent defying gravity. It was during these grueling years that he met Martha, a woman whose grace was as sturdy as the foundations he poured. Their early life was a masterclass in shared sacrifice, a period of existence that their daughter Emma would later choose to treat as a shameful secret rather than the sacred bedrock of her own privilege. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the industrial district, a space so cramped that the smell of Gerald's work-worn boots and the scent of Martha's cheap tea were perpetually intertwined. The walls were a faded, sickly shade of beige that seemed to absorb the gray light of the city. Yet within those walls there was a warmth that no designer interior could ever replicate. Every evening they sat at a small, chipped wooden table, the very ancestor of the mahogany piece that would one day trigger a family's downfall, and shared a single bowl of oatmeal for dinner, a tactical decision made to save every possible cent for Emma's future. Gerald would often joke that the oatmeal tasted like success, even when his muscles were screaming in protest, and his eyes were heavy with the exhaustion of a double shift. It was on one particularly bitter winter night in 1988, after Gerald had returned home with frostbitten fingers and a paycheck that barely covered the heating bill, that he took Martha's hands in his and made the promise that would define the rest of his life. He looked at the cracked ceiling of their tiny kitchen and swore that one day he would build her a sanctuary, a house of glass and marble and light, where the wind wouldn't whistle through the floorboards and where they would never have to share a meal out of necessity again. He described the Willow Estate in vivid detail that night, 30 years before it existed, painting a picture of white pillars and a view of a misty lake that would reflect the orange hue of a permanent sunset. He told her it would be a place for their grandchildren to run through hallways that didn't end in dead ends, a place where the Sterling name would finally mean more than just a line on a workers' union roster. As the decades passed, Gerald quietly transitioned from the man who hauled the bricks to the man who owned the trucks, and eventually, to the man who owned the land. He utilized his deep, intimate knowledge of the construction industry to make strategic, anonymous investments in patents and shell companies, building an invisible empire while continuing to wear the same faded flannel shirts and drive the same rusted truck that he had owned for 15 years. He never felt the need to broadcast his wealth. For Gerald, the money was merely a tool to fulfill the promise he had made in that beige-walled apartment. When Martha passed away 5 years ago, she died knowing that the promise had been kept. The Willow Estate was completed just months before her final breath, a Victorian-style masterpiece that overlooked the very lake Gerald had described in 1988. It was a monument to their love, a fortress of stability that Gerald intended to be a multi-generational home. He handed the keys to Emma and her husband Marcus, not as an act of surrender but as an act of supreme paternal trust, inviting them to live in the luxury his sweat had paid for. He didn't realize then that Emma, the girl he had once carried on his shoulders to see the city lights, had been fundamentally altered by the Ivy League education and the elite social circles his money had bought her. She had begun to view her father's working-class identity not as a source of pride, but as a stain on the polished surface of her new life. Under the influence of Marcus, a man who spoke in the hollow, sharp jargon of corporate acquisitions and wore suits that cost more than Gerald's first house, Emma started to see her father as a financial liability and a ghost haunting her expensive lifestyle. The microaggressions began slowly, a request to move his rusted piece of junk truck from the driveway because it embarrassed her before business partners, a suggestion that he stay in the garden while she hosted her socialite friends. A subtle but persistent erasure of his presence from the very house he had built with his own hands. Gerald watched all of this with a silence that Emma and Marcus mistook for weakness. Unaware that the builder was watching the cracks in his family's foundation with the same expert eye he used to evaluate a failing structure, the arrival of Marcus into the family dynamic acted as a catalyst for the final decay. He was a man who measured worth in stock options and social proximity, looking at Gerald not as the patriarch who provided the very floor he stood upon, but as a relic of a primitive era of labor. Marcus began to treat the Willow estate as his own personal headquarters, inviting city elites and venture capitalists to dinners where Gerald was treated as an uninvited guest. The daily atmosphere grew increasingly frigid, the air thick with the unsaid insults that hung over the breakfast table like a fog. Gerald would often find himself standing in the garden Martha had loved, touching the petals of the roses she had planted, while inside the house, Marcus and Emma plotted ways to optimize the property, treating the legacy of his labor as a mere asset to be liquidated for their next social climb. The history of Gerald Sterling was written not in the transient medium of ink, but in the deep, permanent fissures of his palms, a topographical map of 40 years spent in the brutal, unrelenting service of American infrastructure. To perform a forensic examination of the collapse of the Sterling family, one must first analyze the biological record of structural reinforcement found in the hands that built its foundations. Beginning in the early 1980s, when Gerald was a young operative navigating the high iron and deep trench projects that defined a generation of manual labor, these were not merely hands, they were instruments of raw physical torque, characterized by a permanent landscape of yellowed, calcified calluses that had reached a fatigue limit where they deadened the somatic sensation of heat and cold, transforming his touch into something more akin to the texture of sun-bleached, high-density oak. Underneath his fingernails, a permanent residency of industrial grit had established itself, a microscopic mixture of Fe3O4 iron filings inhaled during the 1982 Skyway Bridge expansion, pulverized calcium carbonate limestone from the Great Lakes quarries, and the residual carbon soot of countless turbocharged diesel engines that no amount of industrial-grade caustic soap or abrasive scrubbing could ever truly dislodge from the epidermal stratification. Each scar on his forearms functioned as a dated entry in a ledger of resilience, a jagged white hypertrophic line from a snapping 5/8-inch steel cable during a regional bridge reinforcement in 1984. A mottled patch of skin from a Grade 2 chemical burn sustained while laying the subterranean foundations for a metropolitan power grid in 1987, and the rhythmic, arthritic clicking of his metacarpal joints, which spoke of 4 decades of gripping, vibrating jackhammers and heavy-duty welding torches. This sensory history of Doyle stood in a state of irreconcilable sheer stress against the modern world's growing disdain for the physical, a theme that would eventually serve as the primary fault line in the Sterling family's structural integrity. Gerald's philosophy was grounded in the visceral reality of the 1980s work ethic, where value was extracted from the earth through the calculated application of human kinetic energy. Yet as his wealth grew in the profound silence of Nova Holdings, he remained a man defined by the texture of the work itself, unaware that the very legacy he was constructing, brick by arduous brick, would eventually be viewed as a source of deep-seated embarrassment by those destined to inherit it. The internal architecture of Gerald's resolve was further fortified by a single, private moment of profound spiritual and emotional consequence, the sacred promise made to his late wife, Martha Sterling, during her final days in a clinical setting that Gerald had largely financed through his early successes in infrastructure speculation. The hospital wing, characterized by its acoustic damping and the sterile 45 parts per million scent of fading lavender, served as the crucible for an oath that would dictate the remainder of Gerald's biological and financial life. As the rhythmic hum of the life support machinery provided a mechanical staccato to her fading pulse, he leaned close to her and swore a contractual imperative that the Willow estate would not merely be a residence, but a physical manifestation of their shared resilience, a sanctuary that would remain a symbol of sterling stability regardless of the external pressures of a changing social landscape. The linguistic nuances of this oath were absolute, involving a commitment to preserve the foundation against all decay, whether of stone or of spirit, a phrase Gerald would replay in the forensic theater of his mind for years to come. The Willow estate itself was reconstructed under Gerald's obsessive forensic supervision, treated not as a mere building project, but as a temple of resilience, utilizing materials that mirrored his own constitution. He personally selected cold, heavy stone quarried from the same Appalachian regions where he had labored as a young man, and massive load-bearing timber beams of old-growth Douglas fir that required specialized cranes to set, ensuring that every joint and every seam was executed with a forensic level of architectural precision that accounted for thermal expansion and seismic shifts. The Willow estate was designed to outlast the fickle, aesthetic trends of modern design, its heavy-gauge steel reinforcements and thick masonry walls providing a literal and metaphorical barrier against the chaotic entropy of the outside world. To Gerald, the estate was Martha's living surrogate, and every polished surface of the hand-rubbed mahogany and every reinforced foundation footing was an act of continued devotion, a silent, ongoing dialogue between a man of the earth and the woman who had been his only true north. This oath was the singular pillar upon which his entire psychological framework rested, and it was this very sanctity that Emma and Marcus would eventually desecrate, triggering the systematic activation of the sterling collapse through a process of psychological erosion that I, as a forensic observer, have categorized as a total structural failure of filial character. The psychological decay of Emma Sterling, Gerald's only daughter, provides a chilling case study in the transition from a state of childhood gratitude to one of entitled estrangement. As a young girl, she had watched her father return from the job sites, her small hands lost in the massive sandpaper grip of his palms. But as she moved through the elite educational institutions Gerald's labor provided, institutions where the curriculum favored abstract theory over the physical reality of construction, a slow-acting rot began to take hold of her perception. She began to view her father's hands not as symbols of provision and protection, but as embarrassing artifacts of a lower social stratum, grotesque reminders of a manual past that she wished to surgically excise from her identity. A sentiment she openly expressed during a high-conflict exchange when she told him his presence at her social functions was unbecoming of their current status. This decay was nurtured by her husband, Marcus, a man whose parasitic arrogance was masked by a thin veneer of corporate sophistication and an unearned sense of intellectual superiority derived from his marginal success in digital marketing. Marcus viewed Gerald through a lens of profound dismissal, categorizing the patriarch as mere maintenance staff for a world that Marcus believed he himself directed through the manipulation of spreadsheets and the curation of networking events. In the high-conflict dynamic of the household, Marcus and Emma formed a localized cabal of entitlement, frequently speaking over Gerald at the dinner table as if he were a pauper who had wandered into their presence by mistake, rather than the very source of the 1,200 thread-count linens and the climate-controlled environment that sustained them. They practiced a form of social erasure, treating Gerald as a financial burden whose old-school values were a stagnant pool of outdated morality that hindered their ascent into the upper echelons of modern society, while simultaneously utilizing his credit lines to fund a $20 zero luxury cruise and a down payment on a luxury penthouse they could not afford to maintain. Marcus would often mock Gerald's silence, unaware that it was not a sign of cognitive decline or submission, but was instead a form of forensic observation. Gerald was witnessing the collapse of their character with the same objective distance he used to inspect a failing retaining wall, waiting for the moment when the structural integrity of their relationship would finally give way to the weight of their own arrogance. The grand celebration dinner, ostensibly held to honor Marcus's recent minor professional promotion, served as the definitive site of familial betrayal, a slow-motion catastrophe that Gerald documented with minute-by-minute internal precision. The event was staged at the massive mahogany table Gerald had commissioned years prior, its sweetenia macrophylla grain deep and its polish so reflective, achieved through a 10-step abrasive process, that it captured the flickering candlelight like a dark, unforgiving mirror. The seating arrangement was the first calculated strike. Marcus and Emma had occupied the central positions, surrounding themselves with invited associates who shared their disdain for the foundational, while Gerald was relegated to the cold isolation of a kitchen folding chair, a flimsy utilitarian object of tubular steel, placed at the far end of the room, dangerously close to the swinging door of the service area. As the evening progressed, the air grew thick with the sound of sterling silver clinking against fine bone china, sounds that should have signified domestic harmony, but instead felt like the rhythmic striking of a funeral bell against a failing hull. Marcus held court, his voice amplified by a parasitic arrogance as he mocked the slow-witted nature of those who worked with their hands, specifically referring to Gerald as someone who had amounted to nothing more than a glorified janitor for his own bank account. Emma participated in the systematic dehumanization of her father, offering dismissive glances whenever he attempted to contribute a thought, her silence a form of active collusion in her husband's cruelty. The food, a lavish spread of osso buco and truffle-infused risottos, grew cold on Gerald's plate. Symbolizing the final death of the familial bond, the fats congealed into a white, waxy substance and the sauces broke, mirroring the curdling of the love Gerald had once held for his daughter. Marcus even went so far as to suggest that Gerald should move into the basement to make room for a home gym, stating, "You'd be more comfortable down there with your tools anyway, since you're basically maintenance staff now." Throughout the 3 hours and 12 minutes of sustained insult, Gerald maintained a silence that was misinterpreted by the heirs as defeat, but was in fact the manifestation of silence as strength. A gathering of forensic evidence that signaled the transition from a state of parental patience to one of technical retribution. The transition into the technical and legal phase of the Sterling collapse was initiated under the cover of what Gerald internally labeled the Midnight Protocol, a strategy executed with the cold, logistical precision of a seasoned infrastructure engineer. While Emma and Marcus viewed Gerald as a financial non-entity, a pensioner whose dwindling resources they planned to eventually seize through a series of forged signatures they were already discussing, the forensic reality was that Gerald remained the sole proprietor and majority shareholder of Nova Holdings, a discrete corporate entity that held the title to the Willow Estate, several offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a diversified portfolio of industrial real estate. Gerald had kept his 51% controlling interest hidden behind layers of private trust agreements and shell companies, allowing the heirs to believe they were the masters of their own domain while he functioned as the invisible architect of their entire reality. On the night following the dinner betrayal, Gerald met with his legal counsel, a man of clinical efficiency who understood the weight of a fiduciary betrayal to activate the social breach trigger he had prepared years earlier. The legal documents were masterpieces of restrictive logic, drafted on 120 GSM heavyweight bond paper with a watermark of a willow tree, and signed in midnight blue archival ink that seemed to absorb the light of the room. These documents contained specific clauses of revocation that allowed for the immediate seizure of all assets in the event of documented elder abuse or a failure of the heirs to maintain the structural integrity of the family covenant. Drawing from the "I gave the greedy hires exactly what they wanted" motif, Gerald prepared to grant them the total independence they had so loudly demanded, an independence that came with the immediate revocation of all corporate support, the freezing of all credit lines associated with Nova Holdings, and the systematic reclamation of every physical asset Gerald had provided, from the $200,000 Mercedes in the driveway to the very silverware they had used to mock him. The dynamic of power was inverted in a single session of signing and stamping, as the cold logic of the contract overrode the emotional ties of biology, transforming the heirs from pampered successors into legal trespassers within their own lives. The logistical execution of the Dawn Exodus was a military-grade operation that began at precisely 4:14 a.m. while the mansion was still shrouded in the blue pre-dawn mist of a quiet Tuesday morning. The silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the rhythmic, pneumatic hiss of air brakes and the low, guttural rumble of three Peterbilt 389 moving trucks, their Cummins X15 engines idling with a deep, frequency vibration that rattled the windows of the estate. A team of 20 professional movers, clad in dark, utilitarian uniforms with high-visibility 3M reflective tape and moving with a terrifying systematic efficiency, entered the mansion through the service entrance Gerald had unlocked. The sound of their heavy, steel-toed boots on the polished marble floors of the foyer echoed through the empty halls like a countdown to total social erasure. Under Gerald's dispassionate forensic supervision, they began the process of removing every item of value that he had provided over the course of 4 decades, not just the furniture and the artwork, but the very fixtures of a life built on his labor. They stripped the rooms of the 500-pound mahogany dining table, the antique grandfather clocks that Martha had cherished, clocks that measured the hours of his toil, and the bespoke tapestries that had been chosen to soften the stone walls. Each item was wrapped in industrial-grade polyethylene bubble wrap, the sound of the cells bursting providing a sharp, percussive soundtrack to the dismantling of a home. The movers worked in a choreographed silence, their shadows stretching long against the walls as the first rays of the rising sun began to hit the windows, illuminating the dust motes that now danced in the vacated spaces. By the time the heirs were roused by the sound of the final truck's hydraulic liftgate, the mansion had been transformed into a skeletal monument to their own greed. The sensory detail of the rising sun hitting the empty, echoing rooms was a profound symbol of the total financial erasure they had invited upon themselves. The world they had occupied was gone, reclaimed by the man they had attempted to relegate to a folding chair, leaving them with nothing but the forensic reality of their own unearned arrogance and the cold, unyielding stone of an empty house that they no longer had the legal right to occupy. As the final truck cleared the reinforced gates of the Willow estate, Gerald Sterling stood on the threshold for a final moment, his physical presence reflecting a state of sustainable peace and absolute emotional clarity that transcended the pain of the preceding years. He was no longer the financial burden or the embarrassment defined by Emma's selective memory. He was a man who had fulfilled a sacred promise to the dead while finally answering the betrayal of the living with the surgical precision of a structural engineer. The forensic account of the Sterling collapse ends not with a plea for reconciliation or a moment of dramatic dialogue, but with the quiet, heavy click of the estate's main gate, a custom-forged iron structure, as it locked for the last time under his control. Gerald walked away from the hollowed estate without a backward glance, his gait steady despite the decades of labor that had weighed upon his frame, his hands deep in his pockets, feeling the familiar grit of his own history. He had achieved a state of emotional clarity that rendered the heirs' subsequent panicked calls and desperate, futile legal maneuvers entirely irrelevant. They were now ghosts haunting a structure they could no longer afford to heat, their voices lost in the vast empty spaces where a family had once existed. The forensic reality was final. Every provision had been withdrawn, every support beam of their unearned entitlement had been cut, and the Sterling name had been reclaimed by the only person who understood the true cost of its creation. The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat, but the profound, enduring silence of a promise kept and a betrayal answered with the surgical precision of a man who knew exactly how to build a world and exactly how to let it fall when its foundations had turned to sand. The collapse was total, a structural failure of character that left no room for salvage, only the clean, cold air of a new morning and the enduring industrial grit of a life well worked. In the final analysis, Gerald Sterling found the quiet revenge of the disrespected to be the most resilient structure of all, a legacy of silence that would stand long after the stone of the Willow estate had been reclaimed by the earth from which it was quarried. This was not merely the end of a family, it was the completion of a forensic cycle, a reclamation of dignity, through the systematic erasure of those who had sought to bury it under a layer of modern disdain. Gerald moved toward his next chapter with the sustainable peace of a man who had finally cleared the site for a new, more honest construction, leaving the ruins of his heirs' ambition to crumble in the shadow of the man they had failed to truly see. The longitudinal study of Gerald Sterling's professional trajectory reveals a biological and psychological blueprint defined by the abrasive mechanics of the late 20th century American infrastructure expansion. To understand the collapse of the Sterling family, one must first perform a forensic audit of the 40-year period between 1980 and to 2020, an era where Gerald functioned as a primary tectonic force in the manual labor sector. This was not merely a career. It was a slow-motion collision between old-school values and a modern world that was increasingly pivoting toward the ephemeral. In the sweltering humidity of the 1980s, specifically during the 1987 interstate bridge overhauls, Gerald's physical form underwent a systematic restructuring. The skin on his palms transformed into a biological shield, characterized by microscopic fissures and keratinized ridges that reflected the specific grip strength requirements of operating heavy pneumatic machinery. To a forensic biographer, calluses are historical documents. They speak of thousands of hours spent wrestling with the Ingersoll Rand 90-pound pavement breakers, tools that emitted high-frequency vibrations that eventually caused a permanent, low-level resonance in his skeletal structure. The scent of his life during this epoch was a volatile mixture of diesel exhaust, curing epoxy, and the sulfurous tang of wet concrete. He possessed a mechanistic understanding of late-century construction, the way a steel girder would groan under thermal expansion, or how the specific chemical reaction of a foundation pour would change if the dew point shifted by 3 degrees. This was a man who lived through the quiet sacrifices of the blue-collar veteran, accepting the bony fatigue as a necessary tax for a future of stability. His hands, often stained with the indelible grit of iron ore and hydraulic fluid, were the primary instruments of his loyalty, yet they would eventually become the very markers of embarrassment used by his successors to justify his marginalization. This era of unrelenting exertion was anchored by a private history and a sacred oath shared with his late wife, Martha. Their relationship was built on what Gerald termed an honest connection, a bond that required no performative flourishes or digital validation. When Martha entered the final stages of a degenerative illness, the nature of Gerald's labor shifted from industrial manifestation to the construction of a sanctuary. The Willow Estate was never intended to be a mere residential structure. It was a manifestation of an oath. To conduct an architectural audit of the estate is to understand the depth of Gerald's grief and his commitment to sustainable peace. Every square inch of the property was a technical response to the chaos he anticipated following Martha's departure. He selected Honduran mahogany for the interior joinery not for its prestige, but for its grain density and its refusal to warp under environmental stress. The woodworking utilized traditional mortise and tenon joinery, a deliberate choice that mirrored Gerald's belief in structural integrity over modern, fast-fix adhesives. The gardens were a geological masterpiece, featuring bluestone sourced from a specific quarry in Vermont, hand-selected for its high mineral content, and the way its slate-gray surface would turn a deep, reflective charcoal after a summer rain. Gerald spent 600 hours hand-placing the stones for the retaining walls, ensuring that each piece was locked into place by gravity and friction rather than mortar. On her deathbed, Martha extracted a final promise that the Willow Estate would remain a stronghold against the familiar chaos of the modern world. For Gerald, the estate was a physical extension of his loyalty, a landscape of balanced living where native flora was encouraged to grow in a systematic, self-sustaining loop. The stone, the mahogany, and the wide, open halls were not just luxury items. They were the defensive fortifications of a man who understood that true peace is something that must be engineered with ruthless precision. The forensic markers of the Sterling family decay began with the parasitic inversion of Gerald's daughter Emma and her husband Marcus. As Gerald moved into his 7th decade, the psychological profile of his children shifted from performative gratitude to a state of parasitic arrogance. Marcus, a man whose entire identity was constructed from the manipulation of social circles and the wearing of tailored Italian suits, viewed Gerald's history with a detached, analytical disdain. He arrived into the family dynamic as a source of familiar chaos, always seeking to leverage the Willow Estate's prestige to bolster his own standing in the corporate world. Marcus would frequently mock Gerald's embarrassing hands in front of business associates, suggesting that the rough, scarred skin of a man who had actually built the city was a sign of intellectual deficiency. Emma, caught in an emotional loop of entitlement, began to view the estate not as the product of her father's 40-year sacrifice, but as her natural birthright. She viewed her father's old-school values as a financial burden, an obsolete operating system that needed to be overwritten. To Emma and Marcus, Gerald was a guest who had forgotten to leave his own home, a maintenance staff member who was tolerated only because he held the keys to the kingdom. They were unaware that Gerald's silence was not a sign of cognitive decline, but a form of strategic observation. He watched as they discussed how quickly they could list the house after he was gone, their voices carrying through the mahogany halls they had never paid for. This was a raw, relatable marriage of greed and arrogance, a parasitic relationship where the hosts were viewed as obstacles rather than providers. The betrayal was slow, systematic, and eventually total, leading to a minute-by-minute anatomy of a final dinner that Gerald would later categorize as the terminal event of their relationship. The grand celebration was ostensibly held to commemorate Marcus's promotion to a senior executive role within a firm he believed was autonomous. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The seating arrangement in the grand dining room was a deliberate act of exclusion. Marcus and his high-powered associates were seated at the grand mahogany table, the very table Gerald had selected with Martha decades prior. Gerald, the owner of the house and the source of the evening's funding, was relegated to a cold, rattling kitchen folding chair placed at the far end of the room near the swinging pantry door. The physics of the chair, a cheap, thin-gauge steel frame, provided a sharp contrast to the solid, unmoving mahogany that Marcus occupied. Throughout the evening, the air was thick with the scent of artisanal courses and vintage wines, specifically a 2012 Cabernet that Marcus had uncorked without permission. While the guests were served seared duck and truffle risotto, Gerald was presented with a plate of cold, gelatinous leftovers from 3 days prior, an act of disrespect that Emma defended as a way to avoid confusing him with the complex menu of the night. Marcus, emboldened by the wine, began a minute-by-minute anatomy of Gerald's perceived failures. He mocked the calluses on Gerald's hands, referring to them as laborer's leprosy, and joked to the table that old people should accept they are obsolete once their physical utility has been exhausted. He went so far as to call Gerald a maintenance staff member in his own home, laughing as he told his associates that a man of Gerald's limited intellect was lucky to have a family to look after his affairs. Gerald remained silent, his presence a calm, unmoving center amidst the storm of Marcus's hubris. He watched his daughter laugh as Marcus suggested that a hidden will or an empty coffin was all that remained of Gerald's legacy. This dinner was the final evidence required. It was the moment Gerald realized that the powerful leader protecting the vulnerable must now protect the legacy of his wife from his own children, unbeknownst to the parasitic pair. Gerald had maintained a secret life as the primary power behind Nova Holdings, a massive multi-tiered conglomerate that he had quietly built using the dividends from his early industrial successes. While Marcus was playing at being a high-powered executive, Gerald was the silent architect of the very economic ecosystem Marcus inhabited. The mechanics of the counterstrike were contained in a document Gerald referred to as the Midnight Protocol. This was a dense thicket of corporate law and tactical legal filings designed to strip the family of their resources with surgical precision. As the house fell into a post-celebration sleep, Gerald moved with a level of emotional clarity he hadn't felt since Martha's passing. He sat in his study, his rough hands resting on the mahogany desk, and activated a series of UCC-1 liens and Article 9 security interests that he had maintained through a secret social circle of the city's most elite attorneys. Because Gerald held a 51% controlling interest in every entity that funded Emma and Marcus's lifestyle, he was able to systematically revoke their power of attorney and freeze their credit lines. The protocol was as elegant as it was ruthless. It involved the immediate termination of Marcus's employment at a subsidiary of Nova Holdings and the activation of poison pill provisions in the family trust that triggered a total cessation of funds upon a breach of fiduciary duty to the primary holder. This was a technical strike of such density that it essentially erased their financial identities overnight. Gerald felt no anger as the digital signatures were processed. He was simply outgrowing the past versions of himself that felt obligated to endure disrespect in the name of a biological connection that had long since rotted. The logistical precision of the strike was made manifest at dawn. As the first light of the sun hit the blue stone walls of the Willow estate, a fleet of moving trucks arrived with military efficiency. This was the dawn extraction, the physical removal of the facade that Emma and Marcus had constructed. Gerald stood on the porch, a figure of grounded stability, as teams of professionals began to systematically empty the house of every item Marcus and Emma had taken for granted. They removed the designer sofas, the imported rugs, and the high-end electronics that had been purchased with Gerald's labor. The air was filled with the rhythmic sound of hydraulic lifts and the professional efficiency of movers who worked without a word. Emma and Marcus woke up to find their world disappearing in real time. They found their bedroom empty, their designer wardrobes cleared, and the very bed they were lying on slated for immediate removal. The panic that set in was a form of familiar chaos they could not manipulate. Marcus attempted to call his legal contacts, only to find that his phone service had been disconnected as part of the corporate asset freeze. Emma screamed at her father from the landing, demanding an explanation for the betrayal, but Gerald only looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. He was reclaiming his domain, protecting the vulnerable memory of Martha from the parasitic influences that had tried to consume it. The mansion, which they had viewed as their birthright, was being returned to its original state of sustainability and peace. They were left standing in an empty, echoing hall, stripped of the power they had never earned, realizing too late that the man they had mocked as obsolete was the very foundation of their existence. In the final synthesis of the Sterling collapse, Gerald stood alone in the center of the Willow estate, a victor who had finally secured a sustainable peace. The house was once again a sanctuary of silence and integrity, freed from the emotional loops and entitlement that had threatened to desecrate Martha's memory. He had successfully shed the old reactions and the burden of enduring disrespect, finding a state of emotional clarity that was grounded in the truth of his own strength. The loneliness of the victor was a weight he accepted with the same grit he had used to handle a pneumatic drill in 1987. It was far lighter than the burden of a family that saw him only as a resource to be drained. He reflected on the quiet triumphs of veterans. The men who know that true power does not need to raise its voice or wear an expensive suit to be effective. The revenge he had enacted was not born of a desire for cruelty, but from a necessity to restore balance to a life that had been skewed by the arrogance of a modern world that forgot how to build things that last. As he walked through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing on the mahogany floors he had polished with his own hands, he understood that his mission was complete. He had built the infrastructure of a city, a sanctuary for his wife, and a fortress for his own peace. The Sterling family collapse was a necessary ending, a clearing of the land to make way for a final, sustainable peace that was as elegant as it was ruthless. He remained exactly who he had always been, a man of grit, a keeper of oaths, and a silent power that could never be broken by those who only understood the surface of things. Standing there amidst the stone and wood and silence, Gerald Sterling was finally at rest, his hands still rough, his heart finally quiet, and his legacy secured in a world that would never again mistake his silence for weakness. The operational commencement of the Midnight Protocol was logged at exactly 12:01 a.m., a timestamp chosen specifically for its transitionary nature between the legal expiration of the previous day and the birth of a new investigative reality. At this precise second, the tactical silence of the Sterling estate was interrupted by the low-frequency vibration of 3 unmarked moving trucks. These vehicles, chosen for their lack of corporate branding to facilitate a discreet extraction, maintained a disciplined formation as they navigated the long, winding driveway that led to the primary residence. The sound of the diesel engines was a rhythmic guttural hum, hovering at approximately 600 RPMs as they idled in the darkness. The headlights were extinguished 300 yards from the entrance, replaced by the faint greenish glow of dashboard instruments and the natural luminescence of a high-hanging moon. When the vehicles came to a coordinated halt, the primary acoustic event was the synchronized hydraulic hiss of the loading ramps. These ramps hit the pavement with a sharp metallic percussion that signaled the beginning of the end for Marcus Sterling's occupancy. The logistical extraction specialists, hereafter referred to as the movers, exited the cabs with a level of discipline that suggested military or high-stakes corporate training. They did not speak. They did not signal with flashlights. They moved with a choreographed efficiency, their thick-soled boots making only muffled contact with the gravel. This was the logistics of absence in its purest form. A cold and calculated erasure of presence that favored mechanical precision over emotional display, the extraction team began their sweep of the ground floor. Moving through the grand foyer with the detached professionalism of forensic technicians, every pair of movers operated within a predetermined zone, utilizing heavy-duty furniture pads and high-tension ratchet straps to secure the artifacts of the Sterling lineage. The atmospheric shift within the house was immediate. As objects were lifted and wrapped, the acoustics of the rooms began to expand. The familiar chaos that had defined the house during Marcus's tenure, a chaos of unearned luxury and arrogant clutter, was being systematically extracted and replaced by a cold, analytical vacuum. The movers prioritized the removal of the 12-foot mahogany dining table, a massive structure that had served as the symbolic center of the family's former stability. This table was constructed from Honduran mahogany, harvested in 1994, and possessed a wood density that required 8 men to lift safely. Forensic observation of the table revealed 30 years of history etched into its surface. There were faint water rings from the early years of Gerald's leadership, and deeper, more aggressive micro-scratches near the head of the table where Marcus had habitually slammed his car keys in fits of entitlement. The grain of the wood, a deep and swirling russet, caught the moonlight one final time as the team tilted the slab on its side to navigate the doorframe. The strain on the movers' muscles was visible in the rhythmic tensing of their forearms and the controlled breathing of the team leader. Once the table was lifted from its position, the floorboards beneath revealed a lighter shade of oak, a ghost mark that documented 30 years of protection from the sun. The echoing void left in the floorboards was profound, turning the dining room into a hollow chamber that amplified the mechanical sounds of the extraction. By 4:30 a.m., the estate had reached a state of dawn emptiness, a condition marked by the total removal of soft surfaces and personal effects. This was the phase where the internal architecture of the house began to reflect the psychological state of its owner, Gerald. In the early morning light, the air was populated by dust motes dancing in the vast, empty spaces where portraits of the Sterling ancestors had once hung. These portraits, rendered in oil on heavy canvas, had been the visual anchors of Marcus's perceived inheritance. Their removal left pale rectangles on the walls, rectangular scars that provided a forensic record of the history Marcus had attempted to weaponize. The absence of these frames fundamentally changed the barometric feel of the rooms. The acoustic profile of the house was now defined by the empty room phenomenon. A soft whisper, which would have been absorbed by heavy drapery or plush rugs only hours earlier, now bounced off the bare plaster, turning even the smallest inhalation into a shout. This was the sound of quiet revenge, a hollow resonance that signaled the total dismantling of the familial structure. The air felt heavy, saturated with the weight of what was no longer there. Forensic analysis of the flooring revealed indentations in the carpet where heavy wardrobes and armchairs had sat for decades. These depressions, or ghost marks, were the only remaining evidence of the life Marcus believed he was entitled to lead. They represented a structural failure of his expectations, a physical record of a vacuum created by his father's total tactical withdrawal. The driveway confrontation materialized at exactly 6:00 a.m., a time chosen for its alignment with Marcus's habitual return from his late-night activities. Attorney Henderson was already on site, positioned next to an old, battered 1998 Ford F-150. This truck, with its rusted wheel wells and high-mileage engine, had been intentionally parked in the primary spot as a symbol of Gerald's grounded reality and his rejection of the sustainable greed that defined his son. Henderson's expression was stoic, his posture reflecting the authority of powerful leaders protecting the vulnerable. He held the legal instruments of the foreclosure in a simple manila folder, a stack of paperwork that represented sustainable peace for Gerald and clinical, emotional punishment for Marcus. The sound of Marcus's arrival was a high-pitched screech of high-performance tires as his European luxury sedan accelerated up the driveway. coming to a jarring halt just inches from the rusted bumper of the truck. Marcus exited the vehicle with his usual arrogance, his designer suit contrasting sharply with the utility of the environment. However, his expression underwent a rapid, bone-deep transition as he looked through the glass of the front windows. The realization did not hit him as a single event, but as a forensic sequence of shocks. He saw the empty foyer, the pale rectangles on the walls, and the ghost marks on the floor where his status symbols had once been staged. The dialogue between Henderson and Marcus was sparse, clinical, and devastatingly precise. Marcus began to shout, his voice cracking with the realization of his displacement. "I want to know where my things are," Marcus demanded, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the empty house. "This is my house. You have no right to touch my property." "My father is a coward for hiding behind a lawyer." Henderson did not react to the emotional volatility. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the younger man with the detached gaze of an auditor. "Mr. Sterling, you are currently in violation of the revised statutes regarding property occupancy following a final foreclosure decree," Henderson stated, his voice a steady, low-frequency drone. "Pursuant to the terms of the mortgage default triggered by your misappropriation of funds from Nova Holdings, this property has been vacated. Your personal effects have been inventoried and transported to a secure, third-party storage facility. Access to said facility will be granted only upon the full settlement of the outstanding debts owed to the primary lien holder, which, as of this morning, stands at $4.7 million. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed. "My father doesn't have that kind of power. He's a failure. He's been living on my scraps for years." Henderson permitted a small clinical smile. "Your father is the primary lien holder, Marcus. He hasn't been living on your scraps. He has been observing your failures from a position of total control." The legal and financial dismantling of Marcus Sterling was the culmination of an exhaustive forensic audit. This audit, conducted over 18 months of tactical observation, uncovered a systemic pattern of misappropriations and unauthorized drawdowns on credit lines that Marcus had assumed were part of his permanent inheritance. The paper trail was absolute. Investigators tracked every cent of the Nova Holdings capital that Marcus had diverted toward his luxury vehicles, his offshore accounts, and his attempts to buy social standing. The reveal of the ownership structure of Nova Holdings was the tactical killing blow. In a subsequent meeting with the corporate board, which Marcus attended under the delusion of his own authority, the truth was laid bare in a series of digital ledger entries. Gerald Sterling held a 51% controlling interest in the entity that functioned as the parent company for Marcus's firm. The look on the corporate board's faces was documented as a state of collective paralysis. They realized that the man they had treated as a secondary figure, a retired veteran with no modern relevance, was actually their primary employer and the architect of their current financial stability. Marcus's reaction was a total collapse of his previous persona. He realized that his father had not merely been a passive observer of his betrayal, but had been the one providing the very paycheck Marcus used to fund his arrogance. This financial destruction was framed by the audit team as a necessary cleansing of the family line, a removal of the greedy heirs who had sought to exploit the quiet sacrifice of a veteran for their own sustainable greed. The final phase of the transition was the formalization of the estate's new purpose. The signing of the deed transfer was a quiet, evidentiary act. Gerald did not sell the property for profit. Instead, he officially gifted the entire Sterling estate to a nonprofit organization dedicated to housing homeless veterans. The ink on the paper was a dark, permanent blue, drying as the first veteran-owned vehicles pulled into the long driveway. These vehicles provided a stark forensic contrast to Marcus's luxury sedan. They were high-mileage trucks and older SUVs carrying the marks of raw resilience, dented fenders, military decals, and the functional dust of a life lived in service. This was the visual manifestation of honest connections and sustainable healing. The estate, which had once bred betrayal and entitlement, was now being repurposed as a foundation for those who understood the true meaning of duty and quiet sacrifice. The grand halls that had once echoed with Marcus's screams of entitlement now absorbed the quiet, disciplined conversations of men and women who had spent their lives protecting others. The irony of the situation was noted in the investigative report. The house was finally fulfilling a purpose of stability, Provided by the very man Marcus had dismissed as a failure, Gerald's retreat to a small cottage on the northern edge of the property marked the final phase of his emotional clarity. This structure was a masterclass in simplicity. Built from old-growth cedar and local stone, the forensic observation of the cottage noted a complete lack of familiar chaos. The air inside smelled of pine resin and old wood, a natural scent that stood in opposition to the synthetic fragrances of the main estate. The sound of the wind through the surrounding oaks was the only acoustic constant, providing a soundtrack to Gerald's newfound sustainable peace. On a plain wooden table in the center of the main room, his phone sat in a state of deliberate neglect. The screen, reflected in the grain of the wood, showed a notification of 11 unread voice messages. These messages constituted a physical evidence log of the family's collapse. There were 4 from Marcus, ranging from aggressive threats to desperate pleas for a loan. There were 3 from Marcus's sister, accusing Gerald of destroying the family's reputation, and 4 from the in-laws, who were suddenly facing their own financial reckoning now that the Sterling faucet had been turned off. Gerald did not listen to them. He did not need to. The glowing screen was merely a data point, a final vibration from a world he had successfully outgrown. He stood by the window and looked out at the calm horizon as the sun began to set, his posture relaxed and his breathing rhythmic. He had achieved total removal of the toxic influences in his life, replacing them with a grounded reality that favored presence over possession. The Sterling foreclosure was not merely a financial transaction. It was a forensic reclamation of a man's dignity. The case file on the Midnight Protocol is hereby closed. The dust kicked up by Gerald's truck hung in the stagnant morning air for a long time. A gritty veil between the life Emma and Marcus had stolen and the empty reality they were now forced to inhabit. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, the weight of the Midnight Protocol began to crush Marcus from the inside out. It wasn't just that the house was empty, but that his entire identity, built on the shifting sands of corporate leverage and borrowed prestige, had been systematically erased by a man he had called a clerk. The withdrawal of Nova Holdings was not a private business failure but a public execution. Within hours, word of Marcus's lack of moral character would circulate through the city's boardrooms like a toxin, turning his name into a cautionary tale and ensuring that no venture capitalist would ever take his call again. He looked at his hands, realizing they had never built anything, and now they held nothing but the cold air of a lakefront morning. Inside the hollowed-out mansion, Emma stood on the bare floorboards of the master bedroom, the silence so loud it seemed to ring in her ears. She looked at the rectangle of dust where her designer armoire had once stood and felt the sudden, terrifying cold of being truly alone. The socialite friends she had invited to the grand celebration had already begun to block her number the moment the sold sign appeared, their loyalty proving to be as shallow as the luxury they craved. She realized with a sickening clarity that she had traded 40 years of a father's silent, unbreakable protection for a few months of superficial validation from people who didn't even know the color of her eyes. She remembered the oatmeal at the chipped wooden table and finally understood that the flavor wasn't success. It was love, a substance she had discarded like junk. The Willow Estate, however, was destined for a purpose far greater than a luxury resort or a theater for greed, as per the final instructions Gerald had left with Mr. Henderson. The property was legally transferred to a foundation dedicated to homeless veterans, men with calloused hands and tired spirits who understood that a roof was a sanctuary of dignity, not a weapon of status. Within a month, the hallways that once echoed with Marcus's arrogance were filled with the quiet, respectful footsteps of men who knew the true cost of service. Gerald Sterling did not stay to watch the transformation. He had reached his final destination, a small, unassuming cottage tucked away in a dense forest of pine, overlooking a lake so still it reflected the stars with perfect clarity. There were no marble pillars or mahogany tables here. The furniture was sturdy oak he had built with Martha decades ago, and the air smelled of cedar and old books. He spent his evenings on a small wooden pier, the rhythmic lap of the water against the posts providing the only soundtrack he needed. In his tackle box, his phone would occasionally vibrate with a persistent, desperate energy. He could see the notification for 11 voice messages from Emma, Sobbing apologies, frantic pleas for money, and the hollow I love yous of a daughter who only realized his worth once the checks stopped clearing, Gerald never pressed play. He had spent his life building empires for others and a sanctuary for his family, but in the silence of his new home, he had finally finished building the only thing that could never be taken away, his own peace. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that while the mansion had vanished at dawn, his legacy of honor had finally found its foundation. Goodbye.